For those of you I haven't met, my name's Sally McNamara and I'm the Asia Pacific Director at HSM. So it's so great to have you all here today with us. HSM, as I'm sure most of you know, is a research and advisory firm founded by Linda Grattan more than 13 years ago now to anticipate and also future-proof what is expected and also what's not expected. So what's happening right now, for instance, we all know. And we're really excited today, proving the strength of our global community here, to be able to bring you an Asia Pacific perspective. So specifically from New Zealand. And we're going to be joined by Beth Bundy later on in the conversation. Beth is Group Director of People and Culture at Auckland University of Technology. And we certainly know that whilst every country began the pandemic at around the same time, we've all had very different experiences. In many ways, because New Zealand was able to contain the pandemic so rapidly, they're further ahead into this new reality than many of us who may still be in and out of lockdowns. So it's going to be a great opportunity to see what's potentially ahead, and also to ask Beth some questions around that and how she's been navigating that. And of course, I do want to say, if you are in a lockdown currently, our thoughts are really with you on that. We all know how incredibly tough they are. I'm very pleased for all of my UK friends and colleagues that you're now a little bit more free, but I know there are many other countries that are in surges. Okay, so let's get into today. So of course, as you all know, and actually we might, if I can get everyone now to switch our videos off, it's so great to see you all. Thank you for doing that with us. And we'll get started. Okay, so we've been running webinars, as you all know, I'm sure, from the very beginning of this pandemic, so from March 2020, where we all realized that the future of work was no longer a conceptual thing, but actually right now. And whilst the pandemic hasn't created all of the complexities we're facing, it certainly has exacerbated many. So for example, we've known for many years that adaptability was a good quality, of course, for leaders to have. But facing a once in a century event means that's no longer a nice to have. And if you've missed any of our wonderful webinars, do let us know. We'll be happy to share the links with you. You can see here the range of topics really brings home the point about increased complexity that we're all navigating. And that takes us to today, where we're going to look at leading through uncertainty, which of course is very much a skill of this time. And in a sense, it doesn't matter what role you have, actually leading through your own life and all the uncertainty that's going on is just as a bigger point. So it's definitely a skill of this time and one that we really need to think carefully about. And actually, leaders on the whole have really stepped up during the pandemic. I know many of you have seen an uptick in goodwill towards leadership. A lot of that has to do with people felt greater empathy and humanity. When you're seeing someone's child or cat on a call or living room, it's a lot easier to feel connected in that way. And that's really something people want to stay for good. The challenge now, of course, is how you sustain this ongoing uncertainty when people start to get frustrated, tired. We've come out of that initial adrenaline rush. And what's going to be required is these leadership capabilities that can be lasting, so shift in those capabilities. So that's what I'm going to speak through for the first part of today's session. Then we'll be joined by Beth from Auckland University of Technology, and she'll be sharing her experience of how they've been leading through these uncertain times. AUT is one of our most active Future of Work Consortium members. Beth is, and Beth is particularly bold actually in how she's gone about leveraging this opportunity in terms of readiness for change that they saw created through the pandemic and taking that through. At the same time, Beth, as she will tell you, I'm sure, is also very real about the challenges we continue to face. and particularly when it comes to tougher or more uncertain economic times. And just before I get into this, I should also flag our next webinar will be on hybrid working. So that will be on June 15, which of course is top of mind for everyone and keeping us at HSM very busy. So as usual, please do use the chat to share your ideas and thoughts with one another. That's what this community is all about. And we'll leave some questions at the end as well. So do put those in the chat. Anna will be keeping an eye out. Okay, so you know that we love a word cloud here at HSM. So let's start with one. And if we go to menti.com and enter the code 5721241, you can see Lottie has put that in the chat for you there as well. So in terms of thinking about just a few words around what's the biggest leadership challenge right now, in a few words, or even that you're experiencing yourself, what comes to mind for you? That'll just take a minute to start coming through. Change fatigue. Okay, here it comes. It all comes at once, doesn't it? Keeping connected, low resilience, keeping the momentum, unpredictable future, what's next? Yeah, it's difficult to answer that, isn't it? Retention, yeah, absolutely. Team fatigue, yes. Isolation, overwhelm, reestablishing rhythm, great point with that. I mean, we had over a year of working very differently. Virtual team management, absolutely. We know it's a lot more complex. We'll touch on that today. Dealing with ambiguity, ensuring well-being, managing uncertainty, tiredness, yeah, screen fatigue, keeping focused, yeah. Staying positive, absolutely. Yeah, leading in a hybrid world, absolutely. Trust. So interestingly, quite a few here on retention, which is something we haven't seen in other sessions emerge as much. So that's interesting, that's coming up. Keeping up with constant change, yes. Okay, resilience, a lot on resilience, of course. Wow, so let's just take a minute and think about how much is within that. That is an incredible amount of things to be grappling with. So we're in the right session today. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. It's always so helpful to see where people are at before we get into the session. And just useful to take a minute for yourself to reflect on that and also know that you're not alone if you're experiencing those things. It's a real universal shared moment here. Okay, so let's get into leadership. So if we step back from the pandemic just for a minute, of course, we know that leadership has always been shaped by the internal context and the external context. And long before the pandemic, the external context was already transforming the role of the leader. So in terms of things like technology, we're already seeing, of course, for several decades, exponential increases in that, increasing automation, ways of working. So the rise of the gig economy and remote work had been around for a long time, increasing pace and pressure of work due to the ability to always be on with our devices, and societal values. So factors like political uncertainty, climate change, social change movements, which as we know are now very rapid and global because of technology. And then the internal context. So that also shapes our expectation of leaders. And if we look at that through the lens of employee expectations, so how do those external factors we just mentioned affect what your employees expect? And then networks. So these have always been incredibly important for effective leadership, and perhaps now more than ever, but they've always been there. And we mean it both in terms of external, so the expertise that they can use and leverage externally to be able to see that future perspective, and also internal. And then the culture and norms, of course, that are present in our organisations as well. So we know all of that was already in existence. But what we're now asking of leaders and what we need of leaders is we need them to be able to look ahead and not know all the answers, but actually to be able to navigate through. So we've seen the greatest shock for many of us in a lifetime. We've got the pandemic. We've also had a huge social change movement, particularly around Black Lives Matter. And we've got really uncertain economic conditions. So leaders are dealing with these emerging realities in addition to their day jobs. And I know I don't need to tell any of you about that. They need to look ahead now more than ever, not to know all the answers, as we're saying, none of us can or do, but to acknowledge, act, and advance through that complexity to be able to cut a path through. So if we think about what acknowledge means, so what we know is as an authority figure, people are turning to their leaders to help acknowledge and soothe emotional distress at the moment and provide a holding environment. And we see that continuing. So to successfully create that holding environment, research has shown us that leaders can soothe and contain distress by offering a reassurance and to interpret what's going on by helping people make sense of what's going on. So not having the answers, but helping have a perspective and being able to demonstrate that to their people. To act. So as organisations are moving beyond this initial crisis point, leaders are needing to take fast decisions and actions to continually help people adjust through this shifting external context. So this is done through building a narrative. And what that does is it helps employees make sense of that situation and to build on collective purpose. So that could be through telling a compelling story, helping to provide a perspective and a visualization of the future, describing a future that's in reach, but also realistic, and recounting values and where the organization is going, because that's something that in all likelihood has remained the same. So it can provide a sense of stability. And then advance. So leaders more than ever can't do it alone. They need to engage the organisation with people that cut across the organisation of all different roles and job types. Co-creating with people helps actually ease their anxieties over the uncertainty. And it also helps to distribute accountability so that not everything is on the leader's shoulders, which generally leaders are happy to hear, but rather their people can be alongside them in this change. So let's think about what are the current leadership risks that we're seeing? So there are 4. Number 1 is burnout. And I think we saw this coming through a little bit in the chat earlier. So we've now been in this pandemic over a year. We've used up all the adrenaline we have. And when we think about burnout, we need to think about time. So the need to respond to the pandemic meant we had to do things so rapidly, like shift our whole workforce to remote working overnight, which before, if we think about, would have taken us years as a change program. So we've seen we can achieve these rapid, incredible things, but there's a danger that actually we've accelerated so much. And if we continue to accelerate our pace of work, that becomes unsustainable, both for leaders and their teams, of course. So leaders also have more tasks. We know hybrid working creates the need for more communication. We saw that come up in the chat with you as well. And people have really looked to leaders to also understand and respond to their unique situations, which we know takes a lot of energy. So we also know that there's a diversity problem in many cases, and the issue of diversity is nothing new. We know through affinity bias, we tend to recruit those exactly like us, and in most organisations that is still the case. So those that have already addressed this or in the process are starting to see the benefits of that. Those who haven't are probably suffering somewhat around that. And that's not only because employee expectations have so rapidly shifted in response to social change, but also because diverse teams we know are more resilient and they're more able actually to anticipate, innovate, and adapt because of that diversity. The third is overburdened. So during uncertainty, people want even more from their leaders. And what we're going through now and into the future is much too complex for any one person to fully hold and grapple with to create that path forward. So that's where this idea of co-creation we keep coming back to. You'll hear in everything we say at HSM, you need that sense of distributed accountability across the organisation so the leaders aren't becoming overburdened with the full weight. And authenticity. So we're asking leaders, of course, to be more authentic and vulnerable than ever. Yet at the same time, when we think about how we've traditionally rewarded and advanced leaders, for most, their development path has not actually encouraged that. If anything, it may have been quite the opposite. And that is something we need to think carefully about. If we really care about authenticity and we want our leaders to have clear, visible values and lead with authenticity, then how do we help people develop that throughout their career? So we've looked at the context of leadership, we've looked at some of the current challenges of leadership. Now let's take a look at what we see future focused leadership looks like. So if you've been following our webinars, you'll know all about networks. And what we know is that it's becoming really clear that networks, both internal and external, are vital for good leadership. So the process of leadership is a shared activity, and networks consist of the strong ties, so the people we speak to regularly, work with closely, and weak ties, the people you might interact with sporadically, but they're just as important because they understand they allow the leader to understand the periphery of what's going on. Leaders also need to be networked in order to support themselves with those strong ties and keep themselves resilient, and also to have those looser ties that allow them to see what's coming down the line. And of course, part of being a networked leader is also to encourage their team to build networks. And interestingly, through the pandemic, our research at HSM, we saw people highlighting that colleague support was one of the most important sources of support. So leaders that can encourage those networks will actually relieve some of the burden on themselves as well. The second is about curiosity. So those of you who know about growth mindsets will know, of course, that curiosity is crucial to thinking about the future. You can build all the networks you like, but if we're not curious and we don't listen, we're not going to see the full value out of that. So we no longer need leaders to have, or want leaders actually to have expert power. We need them to lead by more informational power. And what we mean by that is the ability to access valuable, relevant information to shape their decision making. This requires a couple of tricky things for leaders and things that they, again, perhaps were not raised to be able to do through their career. So a willingness to be advised by perhaps more junior colleagues, and also an honesty to admit, and I guess a humility, a vulnerability that they're not an expert in a certain area, because of course we can't be expert in all of these things. The third is adaptive planners. So thinking about the future, we need to really understand the whole system that the organisation is operating within. And it's about understanding how those policies, processes, practices, and people are interacting and interlinking to affect one another. And also to be able to look at that internally against what's also shifting externally. So those things we mentioned at the beginning, technology, social change, demographics, all of those things that are shifting and how that impacts your internal systems. So for instance, if your reward systems are encouraging people to spend more time on tasks and bill longer hours, and then you try to embed a piece of time-saving automation or technology, of course, that's not going to work at a systems level. And the pandemic has been a great opportunity to think about what you want to keep in your system and what you want to lose. We've really never had a moment of change readiness like this. And I'm sure Beth is going to share more with us on that point as well. Okay, so the fourth is purpose. So it's never been more important for leaders to have a perspective on what's happening and to be able to communicate that. And the thing that we will always emphasize is that's not about knowing everything and it's not about predicting the future. It's about having an informed view that's realistic yet optimistic, including acknowledging what cannot currently be known, because that's a really powerful thing. And we know through this time more than ever that to re-energize, we need to reconnect to purpose. And reconnecting to purpose also allows us to feel a sense of stability during times of uncertainty. And the fifth is well-being, which we also very much saw in our chat earlier. So of course, it's a huge test right now for organizations, and perhaps particularly as we move out of that crisis mode. It's often modeled on what people see leaders doing. And we see it's particularly important in how leaders manage time, because we know that time and place is no longer fixed in terms of how we work. So that means that we might not always be working the exact same hours as our team, and leaders need to think about how they're going to manage this so that individual well-being and productivity is enabled. But of course, as you'll know from our perspectives on hybrid working, the job and the team needs very much need to be front and center. And we talked earlier about the speed of work and the pace that we've seen accelerate in the last year. So we know we can't sustain this mode. It's of course like fight or flight. We get that initial burst of energy to help us through a crisis, but most of us are now past that point. So we need to be realistic about workloads as well. So leaders can help through managing pace of work and also slowing that pace as needed, and through that role modeling and helping set team norms around that. So they're the 5 key capabilities that we see for future-focused leadership as being incredibly important. And before we wrap up, we'll just move into a poll. We'd be really interested to see which leadership competency have you developed most since the pandemic in your organisation? Just give that a minute for everyone to be able to input. This will be really interesting actually to see if it's changed since our last poll on this. Helen, could we see the results of that one? Great. Oh, interesting. So the last poll we ran on this adaptive planner was clearly the front runner, and now we can see it's tied with wellbeing enabler. So that's really interesting. I think the last time we did this poll was June of last year, and perhaps telling that now we're feeling the full, I guess, weight of what we've been through. Perhaps that's why wellbeing's coming through. Great, thank you everyone. So helpful to get a sense of that. Okay, so to finish, before we get into our conversation with Beth, which I'm very excited about, let's finish with 6 ideas for leaders to be thinking about, or for you to support other leaders in your organization to think about. So what we want to be thinking about is connecting our people to co-create, take some of the weight off your leaders and get your people alongside your leaders in the change. We want to be leveraging our networks, both internal and external. We need to consider the systemic implications, including what are the unintended consequences. So we particularly need to think about that from a fairness and inclusion angle, and not making short-term, perhaps easier decisions right now, especially when it comes to hybrid working, but thinking about the longer term in that as much as possible. Self-reflection. So when we're in such a busy period, which it seems to have been quite relentless in recent times, the last thing we tend to do is take time out to have some headspace and actually reflect and process what has gone on, what we've learned personally, encouraging our teams to do that. But actually, it's really important. And when we don't want to do that, or when we think we don't have enough time, is probably when we most need to do it. We know that it helps people contain feelings of sort of out of control and uncertainty, and it also helps them make meaning of what's going on. Thinking about synchronizing and pacing time to enable well-being, and then having a clear narrative on the future that connects to your purpose. So that will shift, of course, over time. Your purpose won't shift, but your perspective just needs to be continually refined and updated as we go. Okay, so I'm now really excited to bring Beth Bundy into the conversation. Beth is Group Director of People and Culture at Auckland University of Technology. Hi, Beth.
Hi, Sally.
And you're joining us from Auckland in your evening.
I am. Kia ora koutou, or hello.
Kia ora koutou. Hello. So Beth, would you we'll just get your video up. Whilst we're waiting for that, I can see 2 of myself. There you go. Always fun. Beth, would you like to introduce yourself to start off?
Well, then I will do that in the traditional Maori way. Ko kadrona te mona, ko wakatipu te roto, ko hokianga te awa, ko pewharangi te moana, ko ngā wai ohore tio te marae, ko Bundy tako iwi, ko Shakespeare te whānau, no Inorangi aho, ko Beth Bundy aho. Good evening, my name's Beth Bundy. That is known as my pepeha, and in a Maori world, that just places me within New Zealand. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. As Sally said, I'm the Group Director of People and Culture at AUT.
Thank you, Beth. That's such a beautiful opening. So, Beth, I think let's start with a broad question to kick off with. So when you think about the last year, how would you describe your experience at AUT? What's it been like for you?
It's been probably like a lot of the rest of the world, a variety of challenges, and in some ways quite rewarding. I'm an introvert, so for me, being in lockdown is something that I perfectly well enjoy, but I know that that's not the experience of most of my people. It's been an experiment in many ways. That's how I've chosen to view it. And it's provided me with much greater insight into the working lives of my people, actually, in terms of how that interacts with their home life as well. Yeah. So it's been a journey. I've been incredibly proud of my academic workforce, who definitely assured me 3 weeks before lockdown that going online was to deliver their courses digitally was never going to be possible. And 4 weeks later, we were there doing the work. It's been exhilarating in that way.
Absolutely. I think we all surprised ourselves, didn't we? We've said that throughout. We've done things that we thought we never could. And then in terms of the last year, what do you feel has helped your leaders navigate the uncertainty? And perhaps, Beth, also you as a leader.
I think framing every decision we made around what we did know, what we did understand, and being clear about what we didn't know and what we couldn't predict, and then looking to provide as much guidance around how any decisions would be made, what factors would influence any change to any current setting was really helpful to our people, to be clear that with them that we understood that they were feeling uncertain and that we all were, and that we also understood people were looking for certainty and maybe expecting that of AUT when that genuinely wasn't possible. So we've been really reflecting on that, and at every point looking to signal where we would like to go if we could, and giving clear indications of what would influence that. And I'm really clear that our people are bored and sick and tired and frustrated in our context, that we live with the potential of going into lockdown every 24, 48 hours, because our scenario is that any community transmission, and at the moment there is none, will probably result in us returning to some short, sharp lockdown to try and manage that. And I am conscious that that's not the experience of most of the rest of the world right now. But it's very tiring, and you do live with, despite the fact that I can go and get a trim flat white and I can meet with more than 6 people inside, it may not be that tomorrow, and that's a tiring concept.
I think that's what's been so interesting, Beth, because you and I have spoken quite a lot about this, and the experiences of every place, every country have been so different. And I'm sure many in the world would look at a country like New Zealand and think, oh, you're so lucky that you were able to contain it. But I think what's so interesting in hearing how you've moved through this and where you're at now, actually, is that uncertainty has just as much been there. So you haven't had the case numbers and the cases, but the uncertainty is still there. And as you say, people are still very much feeling fatigued.
Absolutely.
So,
we're very much a country of migrants. And so, AUT as a university has a top ranking in its internationalization, and that only comes through the diversity of our workforce. And so every single one of those people is currently living with the concept of not being able to go home for whatever particular reason that normally they would have done. Kiwis travel a lot. So whether you're a Kiwi or an expat, you're living in a different world.
Yeah. So you were speaking as to how you've been navigating that in terms of acknowledging it with people. It sounds like that's still very much an ongoing process. And in some ways you're ahead, as we said at the beginning of the world. Can you talk to us a bit more about that?
Sure. So we last year, when we had the first opportunity to start returning to being in an office environment, like many other countries now considering that in some long-term sustainable way, we were aware of resistance, we were aware of fear, we were aware of what needed to happen. We were concerned that our students would want to be back on campus, or our customers seeing our people face to face. And we developed in that first return to work some guidance on how to lead our people back to work rather than manage our people back to work. So we used some really careful languaging, and we gave some really clear requirements and expectations over a period of weeks to give people the opportunity to come back gently and slowly, if that was what was going to give them a greater sense of security around that transition. And then as we have moved backwards and forwards with increasing frequency, but the time that we're away from the office becomes shorter, it's a different burden in terms of being prepared to get notification tonight at 9 that you're not going back into the office tomorrow. There's a different way of managing that rhythm or flow of how any individual can work. So we need to give our students certainty about how those things will operate. So certainly over the last 9 months, we've been really clear and getting more clarity ourselves through greater experience on how to make those transitions as seamless as possible for our employees at home and our students experiencing that change in teaching delivery, and also getting their feedback, getting both my staff feedback and student feedback on what they want, what's changed for them, what helps that be better for them when it happens, and trying to respond to that as best we can.
Yeah. And so it sounds like, Beth, the news from the future is it's ongoing work, much like culture.
It definitely is. I mean, when we returned to campus in July last year, I learned from the things I'd learned on these webinars around, saying to our people, this is a period of experimentation. Here are some guidance notes around how you might want to gather with your teams. Here are some minimums about what we want people to achieve in the next 6 months around attendance and returning to the office or not. But they are minimums. So you work with your teams first, you work out what your bit of the business needs to deliver and how that needs to work, and then the flexibility comes after that. At the end of 6 months, we went back and asked our leaders how that had gone from them and for what they found frustrating that we could help them with, and reset that 6-month period. This 6 months is coming to a close. And I've got far less feedback from the university and the staff and lead managers on the challenges of this second 6 months. It's very quiet. So either nobody's in the office or everything's kind of working a bit better. And my sense is that it is the latter. Yeah, I think there are some times where I can adjust some settings coming up. But generally, people have returned more than I think they anticipated to the office, because we enjoy social interaction. We're human beings.
That's a really interesting point, Beth, because I certainly in Australia have had a number of questions from organisations worried that they're not going to be able to get their people back in. So it's encouraging news to hear that. And Beth, just to touch more on or go more into this piece that you mentioned earlier, where your academics are saying, no, absolutely not, can't do that online learning piece. I know that you, because we worked together on a project through this time, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how you decided to take this as a moment, even though it was a difficult moment, to leverage the change and I guess be quite bold in that.
Sure. Right at the start of the pandemic and lockdown, we were supposed to run our very first inaugural online jam with the Future of Work. And that was a bold move in and of itself. We have some concerns that came through out of the jam that did eventually occur around speaking up at AUT. And those were well signalled beforehand as well. So there was a lot of concern from my senior leaders around, actually, if we open what they thought was a can of worms, where would this go? And our initial time frame just wasn't going to work for us in terms of it being the middle of the first lockdown. So we did shift that out, but I spent a long time with my senior leadership team encouraging them that actually by the time we got to run the jam in September, it was going to be a great time to say, what have we learned? Like, what went well for you? What's not going well for you? What should we stop and what should we change? And what are you excited about? And the findings of some of those conversations are fascinating. So they said, yes, we're tired, but we're also ready for a lot more change. We want to continue being innovative. We've enjoyed collaborating and we want to do more of that. And so actually going into that conversation, it was like slightly jumping off a cliff and not knowing whether the parachute was going to open, but it did. And the responses have informed the work we're going to do going forward significantly. And in fact, I think they already are. So having taken the entire teaching load online for the first semester last year, we also knew that in Train we have a new learning management system being implemented. I have greater collaboration on that project than I think we would have done if it had not been a pandemic, partly because I think the academics have realised they can do this and they do it better together. So certainly the collaboration is continuing, and asking people to participate in that kind of activity is facing much less resistance.
I think the point there, Beth, and I know we spent a lot of time actually discussing this around leaders, because they felt so probably burnt out and overburdened and so tired. That point you made around they thought it wasn't the right time to open up a dialogue with the entire organization, particularly when you'd never done that. And then the result, as you said, where people said, yeah, absolutely, we're sick of this and we're tired, but actually the process of reflecting together, it seemed, helped people, I think, also be proud of what they had achieved.
Yeah, it was an opportunity to reinforce the things that are great about AUT, to hear them say them to each other repetitively over and over again and tell similar stories. It was fascinating to see leaders who had said, I'm not going to ask any of my people to engage in this, fully engage themselves, maybe too much. See their response at the other end of it, about embracing what they'd heard from our people as well. So that's, I guess, the other encouraging thing, is that people are wanting to refocus back on what is the purpose of the work that our people do, and how might we reconnect them with that. I think one of the things I'm feeling at the moment is, not only do we need to reconnect our people with one another for those kind of wider networks rather than the core networks, but we also need to reconnect them with the momentum, as somebody said earlier, about the momentum of the work and the direction of the work and how their work carries our journey forward, that the narrative of how your work contributes to our mission of great graduates is described to them in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's a great point, Beth. We've seen that a lot through the pandemic. I mean, it was something that was always there, but people wanting to understand how their tasks directly impact and connect to a strategy and to a purpose is especially important when you're feeling tired and stressed and uncertain.
Yeah.
So taking the time to do that, where when we're busy and at full volume and pace, we often just want to issue tasks and orders.
Yeah, I would say that's true. We instituted low contact Fridays. I mean, there's a part of me that doesn't believe that many academics do much work on a Friday afternoon, but the feedback from asking them to, or enabling or giving permission for people to say, do you know what, it's a Friday and we're doing this low contact thing. You can see I'm online on Teams. I've got a green dot, but it says don't disturb, or whatever it was. That's been continued into us returning back into the office, because people are genuinely tired. And I think we've encouraged our leaders to talk with their people about checking in, not checking up, and still continuing that on the return to the office. I'm checking in. How are you now? How is this for you now? Is one of the questions I really encourage my people to ask their people.
Yeah, that point around now is very important, isn't it? Because it could be fine yesterday, but not in this current moment. So it does need continually checking in. And I also love what you say about the not checking up, but checking in. So Beth, I'm interested, when we were looking at those future focus capabilities, so around well-being and networks, curiosity, purpose, adaptability, and you saw the results of the poll, so adaptability and well-being came up top for people. What's the capability you're most focused on now?
At the university level, I think it's probably a mix of adaptive planner and purpose builder. So as I said, reconnecting to the purpose of how does my role and what I do contribute to the greater purpose. So we're in the middle of describing that as finding your greatness. So if we're about making great graduates, we want our people to find their greatness in the work that they do. And then the adaptive planner, I think, as I also mentioned, introducing a new learning management system in the second year of a pandemic is a major for a university. We're, changing the construct of now how we deliver that online. So we've gone online, and now how do we shift it to be an even better experience? That's a big ask for tired people. And so, for me personally, I'm probably focused on that network right now. I feel that I need my core network to be strong around me. And I certainly think that that's what the senior leadership team have established in the last, what is it now, getting on for 15 months.
I was going to say a year and a half, but I think you're right. Feels like 5 years. Yeah. So actually, Beth, that leads me into, I'd be really interested to hear about what, because you yourself are a very senior leader, and we know this year has been the toughest one possibly ever for HR teams who've really carried us all through this year. What has got you through? So you mentioned networks.
What's got me through? Yeah, so I think I'm not a particularly emotional leader, or person generally, but I have had like 3 days where I've had to ring a colleague and just say I'm out. Today I am out. Like I can't do this. So the knowledge that there is, 2 or 3 other leaders in the university who I can call and just, they get it and they'll make sure that anything needs to be picked up, has been really, really key to me getting through this. I'm sort of interested by the people who at the start talked about, you're concerned about retention. I'm kind of more concerned about what it will be like to go to another organization and join another team, because I feel like our team has become so strong through this period. So yeah, I guess that's what has got me through. And also my direct reports, we have spent more time together working collaboratively than before, I think. But just that team, my current concern is kind of the teams beneath that and how well they're continuing to collaborate, whether that's been maintained at the level below that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how do we take that through, isn't it? So Beth, before we open up and see what questions are waiting for us, what's one message that you would like to leave everyone with? What are your words of wisdom for leading in this time?
I went home over Christmas and had a big think about that, because I'd been stuck on 3 terms that David Rock was using last year, and I wanted to come back with 3 fresh ones. And then we hit our first and then second sharp lockdown in Auckland, and I can't shift from them. So my advice to all leaders right now is take care of yourself, look after each other, and deliver what matters. And I can't see that changing anytime soon.
Oh, that's great, Beth. I just took a deep breath as you said, deliver what matters.
Yeah, I guess right now it's being really clear on what that is, because it's been a long time, right, of deliver what matters, which was quite clear in the first phase of this pandemic, but we're now in the long home run, hopefully, of that marathon, and delivering what matters is maybe a little bit less clear. But yeah, firstly, take care of yourself. Secondly, look after each other, which I think my team have done an amazing job at, and then deliver what matters.
Yeah, they're beautiful words, and just I think timeless as well. They're things we should be doing all the time, but until we're forced into a bit of a crisis, we're perhaps not. Thank you so much, Beth, for sharing so openly your experience. It's been such an interesting conversation. I think it's been very helpful for everybody to hear a bit about what you've experienced. And let's see if Anna has any questions waiting for us.
Hi Sally, hi Beth. Thanks very much for sharing your insights. So a few points were discussed in the chat, so thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts, and do feel free to put any more questions for Beth and Sally in the chat. So there was a discussion around well-being, which of course Sally and Beth, you both mentioned within what you were sharing, particularly around the fatigue of uncertainty, but also how we can use time off to enable more sustainable well-being with our people. So Alison shared how she's been taking one-off days to recharge throughout the year, but Felicity echoed your point, Beth, around the difficulty when people can't go home and how that impacts how they take time off. So they're hoarding the time off or taking the time off because they want to have it whenever they can go home into the future, which of course means that they can become more stressed at an individual level, but also at that organisational level. You have potentially this massive amount of time off that has been built up that you might have to leave. So I think that was interesting, this point around time and well-being. that came out. And then a question from Craig around looking forward into the future and how we can avoid the loudest voices. So those that perhaps are experiencing the most pain or perhaps are most open to the change, most happy about the change in the organisation from overwhelming everyone else. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Beth and Sally, on this question of how you can make sure that those that are the loudest, whether positive or negative, don't impact or shape the approach going forward.
I guess we have used more of the what you guys call the many-to-many voices opportunities. So certainly holding Teams live events or Zoom town halls and using the chat function to allow all the voices to come through and managing those really cleverly. You know, you can filter those before you publish them and make sure you're answering everybody's questions. So we've been in that way making sure we hear from everyone and building the confidence of people being able to speak up that way. And what else would I say? Yeah, I mean, even this morning, so for the rest of the world, this might sound mad, but I had a significant meeting of about 60 academics, all in one room at one time. And they were talking about flexible working spaces, you know, it's the new car parking in my world. And we did hear a plethora of perspectives on that because we were able to say, well, what has changed now because of the pandemic within the context of that conversation? You know, that there are many views because the whole world has changed. So I think maybe being able to frame some conversations around that may have been something people wanted pre-pandemic, but actually now we have a range of views is quite a nice way of framing the conversation.
Mm. And I guess to build on what Beth has shared, in terms of well-being, it is definitely a very real challenge around having people see time off as not necessarily being a huge holiday, because that's how we've traditionally seen it. So in terms of things that can help if you have leaders doing that. So I know at HSM, we're definitely role modeling that ourselves as leaders in terms of taking a Friday off every few weeks, for instance. But it's also around, it's worth thinking about as well, how the expectations around time. So responsiveness and allowing people to be able to, as Beth said, put a status update on Teams and say they're having a block of focus time. We know that helps to recharge and re-energize people if they're not constantly responding to everything, or to go for a walk or whatever it might be. So thinking about how to set those norms within your team. And then the loudest voices points, I mean, in terms of that, it's thinking about how you start with the needs of the job and the organization, and then understanding and sort of wanting to know about individual preferences, but also helping people understand that they can't come at the cost of the job, the team, the organization, and that there are going to be trade-offs in all of these decisions that we need to accept.
I think one more thing I'd say on the annual leave is when we came out of lockdown, although we can't leave the country, actually people did take their leave because we talked about how you're going to continue accruing that leave. So by the time we do get to travel overseas, you're going to have, you know, the normal amount you would have had, and the likelihood of you actually going for any longer than that is reasonably slim, and you do need a break. So I was anxious over the Christmas New Year period that people wouldn't take leave, and actually they took more leave than ever before over that period.
Mm. And one final question from Trina around this conversation about connection to the company, personal values, purpose, and Beth, whether you have a sense or seen any increase in connection, people who have increased connection to AUT or to their values as a result of this past year and a half of working this way.
Yeah, I mean, AUT's had some other challenges over this period of time as well, which have been well traversed in our local media and haven't been particularly enjoyable. And so the other reason that a lot of people were anxious of holding an online jam and that kind of online conversation was how would that play out within it? And actually what we saw was the sense that, yeah, people love working for this university. We are a great community. We are stronger together. And so yeah, I do think I've seen a greater sense of the allegiance to the organisation. It might be difficult for me to really go too far with that because actually our engagement surveys over the last 15 years, people love working for us. So loving working for AUT is not something I've struggled with, but we were worried it would have been affected last year, and it really doesn't seem to have been.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Anna, for helping us track the questions. And of course, to Ellen and Lottie and the HSM team for running all of this. And thank you to all of you for joining us. So we're going to continue to explore the most interesting and topical themes that are happening for all of us through this pandemic. And the next webinar will be on hybrid working, which I know is top of mind for all of us, on June 15. So you will receive the link to register for that one. We'll also share a copy of the recording of today and the key insights. And perhaps one takeaway question of inquiry for yourselves I could offer to think about what's the most important thing that came up for you today, and perhaps an action, and make it a small one so you don't overburden yourself, but that you could take around that. So we'll finish there. Thank you so much for joining us all around the world, and we'll look forward to seeing you on June 15. Bye, everyone.